It's the question on everybody's mind. Can my team be the team that gets Lamar Jackson? That and all of your other questions on a mailbag episode of the Locked On Vikings podcast.
You like that on 3, 1, 2, 3, you like it!
You are Locked On Vikings, your daily Minnesota Vikings podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello. Welcome to the Locked On Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, your pal, and the kid you copied off in math class. My name is Luke Braun. You can find me on Twitter at Luke Braun NFL. You can find the show on Twitter at Locked On Vikings. Thank you so much for making Locked On Vikings your first listen of the day. And you can also find this show on Amazon Fire or Roku. Just download the Locked On Minnesota Sports app. It is Twitter Tuesday. Nope. It is Twitter Wednesday. And that means that I'm answering your questions. Of course, we would usually do this on Tuesday, but some big news broke. So we had to talk about Eric Kendricks yesterday. Some Eric Kendricks questions in the bag, but it's mostly Lamar Jackson stuff. If you have any questions for me, you can always send them to me at Luke Braun NFL or at Locked On Vikings on Twitter, LockedOnVikingsPodcast@gmail.com. Shoot an email there if you got something longer, or fill out the Google form in the show notes if you prefer that. You can also leave a YouTube comment, get me a question somehow. I'll add it to the list. But boy, you guys want to know about Lamar Jackson, so we'll talk about that for a good bit of this show. Nikaka asks Lamar Jackson. Gabe asks Lamar Jackson. Kurt says Lamar. Get Quackin says this comment section better be all Lamar Jackson. Shadow says Lamar Jackson. KC Golf Guy says, how would you structure a Lamar trade? Darn Many says Lamar Jackson, the cornerback. Ben from MN says, how do we get out of Kirk's contract and land Lamar? And my favorite one comes from Natchman, who says, why do you want to intentionally get worse at the QB position and acquire Lamar? Which is, I'll get to all of those, but that one is a very confident opinion, my friend. Okay, so here's the Lamar Jackson deal. If you are uninitiated, the Ravens placed the non-exclusive franchise tag on him. Franchise tag deadline was Tuesday. Vikings didn't tag anyone, by the way. If you were wondering, they weren't expected to. So that's all in play. The Ravens use the non-exclusive tag. Sometimes I think it's referred to as the transition tag. So the difference is that usually the franchise tag, as we know it, you probably understand it as a fully guaranteed large 1-year deal and kind of a band-aid to a larger situation where two sides can't come together for like a larger sustained extension. And that's probably the case with Lamar Jackson in some case. They want it, both sides want to get an extension done, but they're way too far apart on the money. So you apply the franchise tag. Usually the franchise tag is kind of final. Like that's it. You give them you place the franchise tag on them. They can't refuse the deal. The most they can do is hold out, I guess, but that doesn't really get them anywhere. They can't negotiate with someone else. They can't hit free agency. They can't do anything. That franchise tag for quarterbacks is $45 million. The Ravens use the non-exclusive version, which is a lot cheaper. It's $32 million. The exclusive normal franchise tag is the average of the top 5 contracts. The non-exclusive is the average of the top 10 contracts. So it's a much lower number. That also comes to the stipulation that Lamar Jackson can go negotiate with other teams. So he can basically behave like a free agent. He can go fly around, meet with teams, do whatever. Ravens can't stop him. He can come to an agreement. Let's say he comes to an agreement with, the Panthers. And I know the Panthers said that they were not in on him, but we'll see how all those teams feel after the draft. Somebody's going to strike out on QB, and then I think their tune might change. But hypothetically, let's say that he reaches an agreement with the Panthers. The Ravens would get the chance to match that deal, to sign Lamar Jackson to the exact same deal as negotiated by the Panthers. And if they decide to do that, then that's it. Lamar Jackson doesn't get any choice in the matter. He signs that deal with the Ravens. But if they decline to match, they say, no, you paid him all that money. We don't want to pay them that money. He's all yours. The Panthers give the Ravens 2 first-round picks. That's how the non-exclusive franchise tag works. So he can go negotiate. There is a chance you go and lose him. And because you're taking that risk, the level of the contract goes down. That's where we're at with Lamar Jackson. So could the Vikings do that? So to one of the questions in here, how do we get out of Kirk's contract and land Lamar? Well, for one, none of this is negotiated. The price is 2 first-round picks, and I guess you negotiate with Lamar Jackson himself, who probably wants something like 45 million. Daniel Jones just got an average of 40 mil plus incentives. So 40 mil a year plus incentives. So Lamar Jackson probably will want to outdo that. So if you're willing to pay him that, and he wants a fully guaranteed deal, which I guess we're used to that. we live in that world already. What's the difference, right? So if you're willing to do that for Lamar Jackson, you can come to an agreement with him as if he were a free agent. You just have to be willing to ship 2 first-round picks to the Ravens, but there's no negotiating that. The Ravens don't say yes to that kind of stuff. How we get out of Kirk's contract? Well, none of that 30 mil in his salary right now would stay with us if he were to be traded to another team. The problem is Kirk has a no trade, but in the world where you're going out and signing Lamar Jackson, I'm going to guess Kirk Cousins wouldn't be too keen to like be in a QB competition with Lamar Jackson. So I would imagine he'd be pretty willing to waive his no trade there. That would change the dynamic. That would alter the deal a bit. So I think that's how that would play out. And then that would make the money a lot easier as well. However, if you really wanted to be super sicko about it, you could, I think with like a post-June cut of Harrison Smith and Adam Thielen, if you cut Zadarius Smith, restructure Brian O'Neill, and I think there's like one other move you have to make, and the Vikings actually could make. Oh, and then a big restructure of Cousins' contract to move more of his current salary into the void years, and then they become dead cap in 2024. You can essentially just leverage all of these contracts and all of these cuts in ways that just like puts all the burden into 2024 where there's room for it, and then bring in Lamar Jackson at like 45 mil a year. And even after you do that, 2024, you're still looking at like 40, 50, I think, $1 million in cap space for that season, which is pretty cool. So, all of that, like the resources are plausible, could totally make it work if the Vikings were so motivated. They're not so motivated. And I guess the reasons for that have more to do with where the Vikings are at and kind of how the situation works. But what's really interesting is that nobody seems into it. And that's sort of weird because you have a lot of teams that are QB needy. The Falcons immediately came out they didn't come out. They said via Diana Rossini, but you can kind of tell when a report comes directly from a team PR department or a team staffer that wants this out there. Like that's not information against the will of the Atlanta Falcons, right? That they aren't in on this sweepstakes because they don't want to give Lamar Jackson a fully guaranteed deal. The Panthers, same thing. Raiders, same thing. A lot of teams in an almost, dare I say, an effort that felt kind of organized, said like, no, we're out on Lamar Jackson. And I think it's the fully guaranteed deal that's scaring teams off. And all of those teams are in position where they can get their hopes up for a quarterback. They can all daydream right now about Anthony Richardson or Will Levis or CJ Stroud or Bryce Young or whoever you think falling to them. They can all daydream about that. But come, May 2nd, the draft is over. Someone didn't get their guy. That's why I think, I don't know. I think the tune's going to change a little bit. But right now it's a united front against that scary, fully guaranteed contract. There are 3 quarterbacks with fully guaranteed deals. I think Dak Prescott's is like functionally fully guaranteed. And then you have Deshaun Watson, which is actually fully guaranteed, and Kirk Cousins. Kirk Cousins has been playing on fully guaranteed contracts for 5 years. And if you read those like athletic pieces about the Athletic where they like talk to anonymous staffers and they all weigh in on the Viking situation, they're all like, yeah, that fully guaranteed contract, I wouldn't want, like they all hate it, they all laugh at the Vikings for doing this with somebody, and that they were like 500 for most of those years. I think winning 13 games this year helps that reputation though. So they just don't, and now you look at where the Browns are at with Deshaun Watson, and of course that one's got a little bit more going on. We don't have to get into that. But it's a situation that nobody's looking at the Vikings and Browns and saying we want to be like where they are, right? And so I think that's where it's at. But it does create this very weird perception. From the outside looking in, the league would rather fully guarantee money to Deshaun Watson than Lamar Jackson. That seems, that's not a great look, I guess is the way that I would put it. And if they don't want that perception, then maybe their actions should change. So I don't want to get too deep into that. I want to talk more about why the Vikings probably won't do this with Lamar Jackson. And I've got a whole bunch of other mailbag questions as well that are on different topics. So if you don't want to hear any more about Lamar Jackson, do stay tuned or just skip ahead to after I'm done talking about it. First, though, let me talk to you about America's #1 sportsbook. That is FanDuel. It is the Gramblin' place here at the Locked On Podcast Network. And even though there is no NFL football being played, you can still go gamble on the XFL. Go listen to the Minnesota Football Party where we do XFL parlays. I even hit one. You can go bet against the Guardians. Just do it. Well, maybe not. Maybe now that somebody's not giving up their playbook, maybe they'll do a little better. Maybe you can actually short it. Maybe the Guardians will be undervalued by the market now. You can bet on the Roughnecks. The Roughnecks look like they're almost an NFL team in the XFL. They're just like wrecking everybody. But you can bet on basketball, hockey. You can bet on spreads and money lines. You can bet on player props and more individualized stuff. You can even bet on stuff like the draft or where Aaron Rodgers will play. All of that is at FanDuel. And if you're new, you can sign up and get a no sweat first bet. That means if you do your first bet, you can get $1,000 back in bonus bets, even if you don't get that bet right. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to do that. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to get that no sweat first bet. Once again, that is FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, make every moment more. Thanks so much for making Locked On Vikings your first listen of the day. So for your second thing, go check out the salary cap video. If all this stuff about incentive structures and guaranteed salary and void years and fully guaranteed and all, if all this stuff is just making your head spin, go to my Patreon page, patreon.com/LukeBraunNFL. Click on the video that says Let's Count Beans. Sit down for a half hour, have a cup of tea, and by the end of that half hour, you will have a much cleaner understanding of what goes on with the cap, and with some visual aids as well, because I think the way that we describe the cap is either straight up wrong or so filled with jargon that it's completely impossible to understand, and I wanted to set out to fix that. But I do want to get to everybody's questions about Lamar Jackson, but here is the one opinion that I think the question that everybody asked, which was Lamar Jackson. To me, that sounds like, will the Vikings do it? And here's the thing. Lamar this really comes down to, so resources wise, yeah, they can figure it out. You give up 2 first-round picks, but then you've got a younger quarterback. He's got to run it. He's a runner. You have to have a mobile quarterback these days and all that stuff. I mean, it theoretically solves problems, right? But it really comes down to how much better do you think Lamar Jackson is than Kirk Cousins? And that is a really weird question to answer because they're so different. And you can kind of tell that I'm like shying away from like ranking one over the other or saying, the difference between them can be quantified in, by this many dollars. I don't know, because it's so different. And here's the reason is a Lamar Jackson team runs a different offense than a Kirk Cousins team. So you're not only taking those guys and their skill sets, but you're also comparing how does a power zone read team compare to whatever you run with Kirk Cousins, probably a rollout heavy zone team. How do those two things compare? And boy, that's an impossible question to answer because it depends on who's calling it, who's playing, blah, blah, blah. You kind of can't, football offenses are melting pots. You cannot just pick one ingredient out. You have to kind of eat the whole thing at once. So I won't get into that, the question about why do you want the Vikings to intentionally get worse at the QB position. Here's where I'm at. I think the power zone read thing that the Ravens do is a more potent offense if you consider the personnel the Vikings have. I think that kind of offense can do more with the talent the Vikings have right now than just a zone thing, the same zone everybody else is running would. I would rather they be unique, right? I would rather they be a team that is more difficult to prepare for than, the team that you've already prepared for this kind of team 5 times this year. Just take all that other stuff and throw it in. Place them too high, and that's it, right? The Vikings offense was pretty easy to game plan for because they didn't have a great pitch outside of Justin Jefferson until TJ Hawkinson got there. So for half the season, it was kind of Justin Jefferson, and if you could shut him down, everything sort of fell apart, right? I think the Lamar Jackson offense has more multiplicity. I think a lot of people underrate him as a thrower to the point there's so many people do it to where I question their intentions sometimes. But I don't think he's a better thrower than Kirk, just like from a standing in the pocket sense, but he isn't a quarterback from a standing in the pocket sense. Yeah, if you take away an advantage that Lamar Jackson has over Kirk Cousins, then you won't like Lamar Jackson over Kirk Cousins as much. Like that's sort of defeats its own purpose. To the point of, well, would you rather have the Lamar Jackson offense or the Kirk Cousins offense? I would rather have the Lamar Jackson offense. However, you don't just get to flip a switch and go from one to the other. If you're running power read, well, the offensive linemen have to now install that. These guys, Ezra Cleveland has never been in anything but his own scheme. Somebody like Bradbury, or I guess you're in a different center now. Ed Ingram, never been really that guy. He can pull, and that's fine. But this is going to suddenly be a different world with different principles and philosophies. Some guys are going to fit, some guys aren't. Look on the defensive side of the ball where they go from one set of philosophies to another. It's a catastrophe. Do you want the 2022 defense to be the blueprint for the 2023 Vikings offense? Because that's how you get it. And let's change everything they do and make everyone learn new stuff. I'm sure nobody will screw anything up. That will take time. And perhaps the gold at the end of the rainbow is worth it, right? Maybe at the end of a 2-year rocky transition where the offense sucks because everybody's learning new things, maybe they become a better version of what they would have been if you didn't do that. And maybe you think that that's worth it. But to me, the juice ain't worth the squeeze. And plus, are they 2 first-round picks better? Probably not. So I am perfectly fine with the Vikings being out on it. And I certainly expect them to be out on it because they aren't trying to make a power read team. Kevin O'Connell's a McVay guy. He's his own guy. He's not going to change the whole way the offense works opportunistically. The thing about Kwesi and O'Connell and really all NFL teams, that's something special to them. They have a plan. They have a long-term direction. They have a vision for what this roster is supposed to be. Just because somebody becomes available, they would have to derail that entire plan and essentially come up with a new plan on the fly. And this is a plan. I'm talking about stuff. Kevin O'Connell had this before he even met the Wilfs. He brought this stuff into the interview, and he would have to be reshaping it on the fly. This is years of work that you are redoing on the fly. They're not going to live in an improvisational world with their careers on the line. That's the real reason not to do it. It's not necessarily merits or whatever. The thing is, this isn't Madden where, well, but Lamar's an 89 and Kirk Cousins is an 86, so let's go get the 89. It's not that flat of a world. Too much stuff would have to change, and changing it is work. Change is not an infinite resource. It takes a lot to do that. And I think there's a lot more spending than just the resources that you can track, if that makes sense. If, continuity is a capital, personnel is a capital. All of these things are resources, and the Vikings would kind of have to spend pretty much their entire reserve of all of it to make this happen. And I just don't think the juice is worth the squeeze. So that's enough about Lamar Jackson. All right. That's the conversation. It's fun. It's completely unrealistic, but whatever. It's fun. It's March 8th, right? Who cares? Let's have a little bit of fun. Free agency's around the corner anyways, and we'll have some real news to talk about sooner than later. Maybe you even have some you're waiting on me to talk about, depending on what time of day or what day you listen to this on. So I do want to get to the other questions here in the mailbag, so I'll make sure that I get to those as well. Let's keep it going. Next question in this mailbag Wednesday thing comes from Connor Lifson, who asks, with Kendricks gone, Asamoah is in line to start, and I can't imagine we'll roll into next season with Dye starting, assuming Hicks will be let go as well. What does the Flores scheme typically look for in off-ball linebackers? So with Kendricks gone, I don't think Hicks's cut is I'm not as certain of it as I was before I learned of Kendricks being gone, because, well, they did kind of get rid of one linebacker. But here's the deal. If they weren't happy with Kendricks' play, I cannot imagine they were happy with Hicks's. And Hicks was the one coming off the field for Asamoah. So we already have a sense that the Vikings thought Hicks was doing worse than Kendricks, right? Now, all the people making that decision have been fired. So maybe Brian Flores watched the tape and has a different opinion. But I would be pretty surprised if Brian Flores clicked on the tape and thought Jordan Hicks did better than Eric Kendricks. So I still anticipate that as well. But I digress. So there's 3 things I think that are important to Brian Flores when it comes to off-ball linebackers. He's talked about all of them in interviews. The first one, he talks about this all the time. You got to be able to get off a block. Stack and shed. You have to be able to get off of a block. You can't be the kind of guy that just gets sealed up and dies, which is funny because that's Brian Asamoah. If he gets sealed off, it's over. He is a block evader. He is not a shedder. He does not get into contact with you. He doesn't get into an engagement with you, then out of an engagement with you. He has to try to avoid it entirely, which makes his path to the ball a lot longer, but he has the explosive athleticism to make up for that. And that's kind of his game in the NFL. And for him, it's more of the mental side of the game and knowing which gap to go in and having the reads be right and all that stuff. I talked yesterday about Trenton Simpson, who has a really similar thing, except he can see where he's supposed to go. He kind of has a little more polish in that way, but he doesn't quite have as good of technique as Asamoah. So that would be a pick a linebacker at 23 kind of guy. If you're thinking about, oh, well, now they pick a linebacker in the first round, that would potentially be who it would be. But neither of those guys can like stack and shed and get off a block. So I don't think Trenton Simpson is a Brian Flores linebacker at all. That's one thing. And then I think the other thing is you have to be able to explode into a blitz. You have to be able to get off the ball really fast and blitz very quickly, because a lot of times those blitzes are made to prey on like the first step of an offensive lineman, but their second step starts to recover. So you got to be by them before they've taken their second, maybe third step. It's got to be already too late. So you have to be really, really quick. So there's your explosion. That's your jumps and your 3-cone and your 10 split. And then the next thing is they have to be able to cover a running back. Brian Flores' scheme uses a lot of cover 1 and cover 0, which by its nature will not ask linebackers to carry the number 3, right? And if that number 3 happens to be Amon-Ra St. Brown, you won't have a linebacker on Amon-Ra St. Brown. They'll split the linebacker out with DeAndre Swift in that case, and somebody else is on Amon-Ra St. Brown, right? Like they work a little harder to dictate the matchup. So you don't need to have a linebacker that can keep up with, star wideouts, but you do have to be able to cover a running back. So the man coverage threshold is still there, but it is lower than it is in more zone matchy schemes. So got to be able to man cover a running back, got to be able to explode into a blitz, but more than anything, he says it constantly, you got to be able to get off a block. Michael Chazan says, I believe Eric Kendricks was as good as any linebacker who played for Minnesota. Who was better? So over history, I have 2 I would confidently say were better, which is Scott Studwell and Chad Greenway. You could go back to the oldies, the Roy Winstons and Hilgenberg and Lonnie Warwick and Jeff Seaman. I think those guys were good complementary pieces to the true Purple People leaders. But I don't think that they were as focal as somebody like Studwell or Kendricks or Greenway were. So I would put them below that kind of crew. You also have like Fred McNeil and Matt Blair. Matt Blair and also Anthony Barr. Anthony Barr had a peak where he was like clearly better than Eric Kendricks, and suggesting otherwise would have been blasphemy if you said that in like 2015. But it's also like they played such different roles and they played together so much, like they helped each other so much that it was always more of a bar talker than it was actually anything like actionable. And I think with Matt Blair and Fred McNeil, it was a similar dynamic where Matt Blair, he was a 3-4 outside linebacker. He was a pass rusher as much as he was a cover linebacker, and that versatility was just a different world. I would say he's probably a more valuable piece than Eric Kendricks was, so I guess you could put him above, but it's like almost a different position. It feels like comparing apples to oranges a bit. I love EJ Henderson. I don't think I would put him above Eric Kendricks. So I guess, yeah, like 3rd, 4th in the pantheon of Vikings linebackers. Pretty good. Anti-Gravity says, was Andre Patterson right all along? Was Shamar Stephen the key to Kendricks' success? So for the uninitiated, this was 2019, I believe. Shamar Stephen was paid a lot of money to be very specialized defensive tackle. He was a run-stuffing defensive tackle that wasn't very productive at all, and he was sort of a black sheep on the defense, and Eric Kendricks and Andre Patterson went to bat for him a lot on the podium. And their argument was essentially, well, he eats double teams. And that is the role of a 3-tech against a combo block. a combo block where, the two linemen will double team a 3-tech and then one of them climbs up to the linebacker, that 3-tech's job is to stop that one from climbing up to the linebacker. You can beat me with your double, but you can't beat me with one guy. You have to both stay here. And then that keeps that linebacker clean, and that linebacker can fly around and make plays. In 2019, you could have argued that Eric Kendricks was the best linebacker in football, maybe Fred Warner. Those were like the two guys. That was the argument. And I think Shamar Stephen absolutely did unlock a greater height for Eric Kendricks. Really did have something to do with that particular season being a step above. Take that away, you still had a very, very, very good player, though. So no, he wasn't the key to all things Eric Kendricks. But yeah, definitely had an impact. And I don't think we were waiting to hear Andre Patterson be vindicated about that. That was something that that was something I just learned when he said that. I was like, oh, that's what 3-techs are. Okay, cool. Good to know. Like, that was just something that he taught me on the podium, which Andre Patterson was very good at that. I love him. Ruben Frost says Darnell Washington. So people are invoking the G word, the Gronk word with him. He's a tight end out of Georgia, probably go in the first round. I think if the Vikings took him, it would turn them into a team that I don't think they're trying. That's the team they're trying to build. It would be cool. I don't think it would be a bad move or anything, but it would take them in a direction that it feels like they're trying to go a different one. So I don't really see it in the cards. But he's like a big athletic freak tight end, very versatile, insane blocker. He's like a bulldozer that can catch. It's super awesome. But I think if they did that, if the Vikings did like a first round tight end, then they're going to be a 12P team, 12 personnel team, a 2 tight end team, that old kind of Kubiak zone, like what they were trying to build with Irv Smith and Kyle Rudolph. And I don't think that's the way Kevin O'Connell wants to live. So I don't think that that's the way that they would be. I don't know. Maybe they do that and they let TJ Hawkinson walk, but that would feel like a lot of resources kind of spinning your wheels if you spent a second round pick's worth of value in total for 2 years of TJ Hawkinson. Feels like their plan is pointing elsewhere, I guess. And like Darnell Washington, like they knew about Darnell Washington when they traded for TJ Hawkinson. Like the college scouting group knows about these players when they make these decisions. That information was already implemented. They weren't surprised to learn that there was a good tight end out of Georgia when they made that move. Denver says, what mechanics do you look for when scouting a quarterback? What are good resources to start to learn how to watch the position? So I would just point you to QB School, the QB School with JT O'Sullivan. His YouTube page is great. His Patreon is better. If you are willing to shell out some money and support him. I've learned so much from watching those videos. And it's not just like a lot of like film analysis on YouTube is very much, here's my opinion and I'm going to defend my opinion on this guy. It's this guy is good or bad and here's why. But JT is like such a breath of fresh air because he isn't really trying, like he doesn't really wrap things up in a conclusion, like, and therefore it was a good game. Like sometimes, tough loss, or so much great stuff on that tape. And there'll be something nebulous, but you're never going to hear a grade from him. He's never trying to quantify. He is much more interested in teaching you the nuances of the position than in telling you who is or isn't good. And I love that about him. So I really, really highly recommend that in terms of some universal mechanical stuff, because everyone's mechanics are different. Like you could watch Matt Stafford and Aaron Rodgers play and get a completely wrong idea of what a quarterback's supposed to look like, because those guys just play different than somebody like Kirk Cousins plays. And that's different than how Joe Burrow plays. It's all different. But I could do an hour on this, and I might at Patreon, actually. That's a QB mechanics thing is like a QB mechanics. Here's the basics for people who never played is something that I want to do maybe in the summer. But when you throw, look at the base. Feet should be shoulder width apart. Feet should be totally on the ground, and they should be still. If he's bouncing, if he's still in the middle of setting his base when he starts throwing, that's going to remove power. And usually the guy is going to compensate for that by winging it with his arm harder and using more of his arm strength. And that's going to cause spotty accuracy because you just aren't going to be as consistent with your arm as you are with torque. A lot of stuff about a quarterback throw is similar to a golf swing, like how if you draw a line from your back toe to your front toe, that should point at what you are aiming at. Same exact thing as golf. A lot of the same biomechanics. You should have a very still lower half and then get all your torque from your waist movement. You want a 90-degree arm angle. If it is an outside arm angle, you're going to miss outside. If it's an inside arm angle, you're going to spray it a lot because again, you're kind of it's like not as powerful. And so then you have to compensate for that. And in compensating for that, you throw it harder, you miss more. That's a few things. Again, there's so many little nuances to it that I can't answer it now. But watch the QB school. You'll learn a lot. Last one I'm going to do, Purple Drink says, I spent this past season getting my girlfriend into football and teaching her about the game, even took her to a Vikings game. She wanted to pick a favorite player, and I went through the players, and she ended up falling in love with CJ Ham. So I bought her a CJ Ham jersey, A+. Love that. I know that Ham will most likely be released this offseason. For the sake of my girlfriend, please lie to me and tell me that everything will be okay and that Ham will stay on the team. I don't think I have to. So if you are to believe Access Vikings, which those guys are pretty plugged in and they were at the combine, they got the sense that CJ Ham sticks around. Nothing they said on that show was a sure thing, and they were clear about that. But wind's blowing that they're going to keep CJ Ham, and that's an interesting choice. It's a more schematic choice than it is, like anything with the merits of CJ Ham as a fullback. But like, it's, do they want to keep a fullback at all? And if they do want to keep a fullback, they'll keep the one they have under contract. But to the broader point, and this is a Jersey point, all right? This is fan talk, all right? Pros, people who know ball, get out. This is fan time, all right? With fans, we got to talk. Buy whatever jersey you want, man. Here's the thing. If the jerseys of former players kind of fall into two categories. There are ones that are eternal. Your Brett Favre Vikings jersey will never be out of style. It will always be welcome at a Vikings game, right? Your Randy Moss jersey is eternal. And most players that are pretty good, right, will be eternal. If I see an Anthony Barr jersey somewhere around, that one's going to be pretty eternal, even though he's not exactly a Hall of Famer, right? Your Eric Kendricks jersey I have an Eric Kendricks jersey. I'm not throwing that thing away, right? That one will always, he was here for 8 years, beloved member of Vikings lore. A rule of thumb, if you got a feature in the history doc, patreon.com/LukeBrownNFL, watch the 7-hour history documentary on the Minnesota Vikings. If you got a feature in the history doc, it's a good jersey, right? And then there are more obscure players, right? If you see a Matt Khalil jersey, that gives people that's a different kind of cool, but it's still pretty cool. Like your Jim Klein saucer jersey is pretty fun, but man, if I see a Jermaine Wiggins jersey, I know you are a baller. So even if CJ Ham gets cut, in like 5-10 years, that is going to be an extremely baller. Imagine walking around seeing a Jerome Felton jersey. That would rule. That would be the coolest jersey you saw that day. So don't worry about it. CJ Ham, no CJ Ham. Your girlfriend will be just fine. I will talk to you tomorrow. We'll either do a draft profile. We'll talk about news. We'll just play things as they come. And then next week is free agency. So we're still going hard on all this stuff. We will see where we are. And as always, Skol.